Well, it's my great pleasure as Dean of the Harvard Divinity School to say greetings and welcome to all of you to our second gathering of our Leadership Council. We meet tonight to discuss the role of religion in contemporary life, to share with you our ideas, our work, and our recent accomplishments. We'll hear more about that tomorrow. And to hear your thoughts on how we can best train leaders with an adequate understanding of religion and its role both in the past and in today's world in the context of that past. Harvard Divinity School is one of the world's foremost institutions for scholarship and training in religious and theological studies. We train, of course, many of the scholars who are leaders in their diverse academic fields and in many institutions around the country. We also train students who enter careers across the professional spectrum, from ministry, whether in parishes or in hospitals or in colleges or in prisons, all the way to people whose vocations take them to education, business, medicine, and public service as well, always being in the forefront in most of these careers. We've just been doing an alumni survey, and we find this borne out in the numbers in the survey, which I hope at a point when we have that material massaged a bit into readable form, we'll be able to share with all of you. I want to note that we are hoping with this group to have the kind of wise counsel and support that will help us to be able to continue to spread a deep understanding of religion in the general public. We are building our faculty literally, not every day, but certainly it seems like every day, but certainly every semester these days. The faculty is growing, and I think with that growth we're getting more and more people who are going to be able to speak to the pressing issues of today as well as to probe the deeper, longer-term issues of the past. Our two-day event begins with tonight's conversation with the 64th United States Secretary of State, Madeleine K. Albright, and with Newsweek editor Jon Meacham, whom I'll be introducing to you after dinner. We'll continue tomorrow with panel discussions on religion and global understanding and on religion and informed leadership with a closing address by Kevin Johnson. We're going to be joined now by Father Brian Hare. I hope I'm going to be joined by Brian for a blessing. Brian, I don't know where you are. Please.
It is a double privilege to be invited by Bill to offer this invocation and be in the midst of the Divinity School again, and to be with a colleague and very treasured friend and mentor, Secretary Albright. So let us pray. God of life and goodness and truth, God of the nations, to whom we pray in many tongues and many faiths, upon whom we ground our search for order and peace, justice and freedom. This night our prayer is one of thanksgiving and blessing. We thank you for the multiple gifts you share with us each day, which are so evident in this room and in this university. We pray for blessing for Secretary Albright, for her intellectual and political work, blessing upon the Divinity School in its continuing service of the life of the mind and the life of faith, blessing upon this university in the many ways it is called to serve the human community. We pray this night for each of us, for all of us, and for these institutions, that we may be sources of intelligence and wisdom, of courage and judgment, of truth and justice in a world that needs each and all of these gifts each day. Amen.
This evening is going to be a conversation with former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, led and moderated by the editor of Newsweek, Jon Meacham. I can't think of two higher-powered people to put in two easy chairs in front of you at this time of the evening. And I know you're excited about this as I am. Those of you who were able to hear Secretary Albright's speech at the Institute of Politics a couple of hours ago know that you're in for a treat. Those of you who, as I have heard Jon Meacham speak, know that you're in for a double treat. So I'm very pleased to be here to introduce them both. As most of you will know, Secretary Albright served as Secretary of State under President Bill Clinton from 1997 to 2001. She's now a principal of the Albright Group, a global strategy firm, and her earlier book, Madam Secretary, of course, was a New York Times bestseller. Her newest book, The Mighty and Almighty, Reflections on America, God, and World Affairs, which I will note, and I'll tell you a little bit later. I think you will all have a gift of this book by the end of the evening. Is if you probably already have it, but then you can pass on your copy, which will probably not signed as the one you'll get tonight will be. You may pass that on to a friend because it's a powerful book examining the role of faith and of religion and religious institutions as well as religious thinking and religious morality in international politics. I'm not going to be more extensive in her introduction because she literally needs no introduction. I guess I should at least mention that she's a fellow academic as well, which we academics always appreciate if no one else does, in that she is the first Michael and Virginia Motara Endowed Distinguished Professor in the Practice of Diplomacy at the Georgetown School of Foreign Service, where she is very much engaged in classroom teaching, which, as she says, is harder than it looks. I think we're also extremely fortunate to be joined by Jon Meacham, who's going to lead our conversation. Jon has served in editorial roles at Newsweek since 1998 and is currently the editor of the magazine, as I said. He's written books and articles, which I won't run through in great extent, although I will mention my favorite, which is Franklin and Winston, an intimate portrait of an epic friendship, about Winston Churchill and Franklin Delano Roosevelt and their wartime friendship and the interaction of this growing friendship over the time of their association across the Atlantic and then in many meetings, how this friendship then blossomed into also a working relationship that has been one of the, I think as Jon points out, is one of the really powerful friendships, or if you like, transnational friendships in politics of the 20th century. Jon's also written more recently American Gospel, God, the Founding Fathers, and the Making of a Nation, which I have here. And if you all would permit me, in introducing their conversation, I'd like to actually take a quotation from each of their latest books to set the stage for some of the things that I think we're going to hear about tonight. Read slowly. I will read very slowly, okay? Let me first, let me turn to the first of these two public intellectuals, Madeleine Albright, and read from a portion, just a paragraph in the latter part of her book, under the chapter Summoning the Better Angels. In the arenas of global politics and interfaith understanding, she's actually at this point has been talking about the degree to which in mathematics and science we've seen in the modern world a great accumulation and progress in knowledge and in wisdom. And she says that before this that in many ways we're far wiser than generations before us in terms of knowing how the world works. But she goes on to say this. In the arenas of global politics and interfaith understanding, however, I am not sure we are any smarter now than we have been in the past. The 20th century was the bloodiest in human history. When the new millennium came, we vowed to make a fresh start, but we have not begun well. Those of you who heard her talk tonight know in more detail how she feels about that. Let me turn now, though, to words from Jon's book that I just mentioned, American Gospel, where in the middle of this book he has a wonderful passage basically on the need for a knowledge or grasp of history, as he puts it. A grasp of history is essential for Americans of the center who struggle to decide how much weight to assign a religious consideration in a public matter. To fail to consult the past consigns us to what might be called the tyranny of the present, the mistaken idea that the crises of our own time are unprecedented. and I skipped them to read one more sentence. Subject to such a tyranny, we are more likely to take a narrow or simplistic view or to let our passions get the better of our reason. We have two people tonight, two public intellectuals, as I've said, two marvelously talented persons of great reason, two people with a great faith in reason, but I think an appreciation of and an understanding for faith as well. It's good and it's bad, and I now put you in their hands.
Thank you, Mr. Dean. I would like to say quickly, I am a Southerner, and we refer to this as being in high cotton, where I come from. So, Madam Secretary, it's a great honor to be with you. My assistant at Newsweek, whenever I have the privilege of getting a call from Dean Graham, which is all too rare, will come running in and say, Billy Graham's on the phone. I know. My grandmother used to say it's like taking candy from children, but candy tastes good. So you do that. Honored to be here. And I'm going to read my favorite paragraph from Secretary Albright's book in a moment, but we'll wait. I have no question. I just like the paragraph. So, where did you first see in your memory, either growing up, as a young student, the connection between faith and politics?
Well, first of all, let me say how glad I am to be here with you, John. Hear me say that, yes. Because I think that you have been a really fabulous chronicler of a lot of American history and a great editor. So thank you. And Billy Graham, I'm very glad to be with you, too. I have to tell you that I'm actually late in coming to this story because I come from a generation of political scientists and students and practitioners who would on a regular basis say, X problem is so complicated, let's not bring God and religion into it. And even though in various parts of life one takes courses and things like that, for the most part, it was something that I deliberately, as a practitioner, pushed away. But what became very evident, especially in when we came into office in 1993 and President Clinton began to deal with the issue of Northern Ireland, which I obviously knew quite a lot about, but somehow the idea that we were involved in watching a religious war between Catholics and Protestants at the end of the 20th century seemed just preposterous, right? Then, also, since the major subject of our time was dealing with the Middle East, it was evident that if Jerusalem had just been a real estate issue, we might have been able to deal with it a long time ago. But since all the parties to the conflict believed that that particular piece of land was given to them by God, it became very evident that it was necessary to know more about it. Now, with that perspective, I then went back and did a lot of reading. And, for instance, President Carter, whom we recently saw together, had obviously spent a great deal of time on the religious context of the Middle East issues when he was doing his Camp David, and talked about the fact that he was counting on the fact that President Sadat was a religious person and that Prime Minister Begin was a religious person, and that he could see if he could find common ground on that basis. But I can't say that this is something that I came to early on, and on the contrary, I tried to kind of push it away.
Was that part of the academic culture at the time?
I think a lot. I think in what your writings are so interesting about is that you kind of are saying to people, admit the fact that you're religious, admit the fact that they're really, that when you're looking at American history or American experience, that we have this very mixed story of being both religious as well as trying to keep separation of church and state. And I think that there was much more of a kind of a sense that being religious or viewing things from a religious perspective muddied things up and created confusion. I mean, we all obviously studied the Crusades or whatever, but you tried to think that was a 20th century thing and wasn't really something that you should be dealing with.
Was there also a kind of, for lack of a better term, class issue, that religious people were either unsophisticated or beyond reason in the sense that they couldn't be rational actors in a drama that you were studying and trying to resolve? And do you think that's changed if that were the case?
That's a very interesting question. I do think that people basically thought that religious people were not rational. I do think, that if you were religious, you hid it. It was very strange. I mean, I worked for 2 presidents that were both very religious. And I think when President Carter came on the scene and there were discussions about born again, I mean, people thought, well, that's a Southern thing. Right. That it seemed a little, I wouldn't say class, but kind of a sense of intellectuals didn't do that kind of thing.
Right. In my household, being born again meant you had a second bottle of whiskey. My other thing, I simply have to say this. I think Secretary Albright's heard me say this before. When you compare the 41st President of the United States with the 43rd, the 41st President thought that being born again meant a mulligan on the golf course. He had no idea what it meant exactly. I think one of the great things about your book, about Senator Danforth's book, and the conversation in the past, say, 4 years, I think. I date what I would say the maturation of the conversation about religion and public life to the release of Mel Gibson's The Passion. I think that it was something that people suddenly realized this was an enormous cultural force, and it managed to get even my colleagues in the national press discovered that there were these things called Christians in the country, and we better pay more attention to them. But I think we are speaking in more sophisticated terms about religion, about its political impact. And to go directly to your expertise, its relationship to our relationship with the rest of the world. And I'm wondering, from your years in the arena, which predates again, I think a broader appreciation of the nuances of religion, you mentioned Northern Ireland, you mentioned the Middle East, was it explicitly part of conversations at the White House, the United Nations, the State Department, that we have to understand what X believes or we're never going to get anywhere?
Actually not. I mean, that's the part that was so interesting, is that people, when you look at, you face a problem at high levels of foreign policy, you try to figure out what the issues are and dissect it and then look at various aspects of it. The incredible part was that the religious basis of it was an afterthought. Now, what did begin to happen, and for me, there was another part that became more and more salient, and that was what was happening in the Balkans. Because all of a sudden, we had to take into consideration that you were dealing with a part of Europe that was quite different, where there was obviously a Muslim influence, and that the question of interreligious issues of Orthodox Christians and Catholics and then Muslims, so that there began to be much more of a sense that, and the question was, and I don't know the answer to this myself, to what extent are things ethnic and to what extent are they religious? But there clearly was that beginning to be that mixture. President Clinton knew a great deal about all of this also. It was very interesting to work for presidents who did have that religious basis and made you think that you really needed to accept what you were hearing from people that you respected that were rational. But it was very much this issue of beginning to learn how religion... when I was writing Madam Secretary, and we didn't have a lot of notes because we all thought they'd be subpoenaed. So, I was in meetings or I'd write something down, and I kept having in my notes, learn more about Islam. And we began to think about how to have seminars about Islam and try to figure out how to learn more as a problem-solving aspect.
We were talking about Thomas Jefferson earlier, and you write about this very well, but I'd love to hear you talk about it a little bit. In one of Jefferson's inaugurals, he explicitly alluded to America as Israel of old. God had brought us across the oceans to this new promised land. To what extent do you think American exceptionalism is a good thing and a bad thing?
Well, I have a very special view of this. I was not born in the United States. I came here when I was 11 years old from my father. I was Czechoslovak. And for me, there was something very special about America always. And the kind of thread of my life it comes through, I hope, in Madam Secretary, is that I have always believed when the U.S. is not present, bad things happen. So Munich, which is a kind of marked event for every Czechoslovak, the U.S. wasn't there. It was a deal that the British, French, and Italians made with Germany. When we were in England during the war, my father was with the government in exile, and so when the Americans came in, everything changed. Then, when the Americans did not liberate Central and Eastern Europe and the Red Army did, that changed everything. So I have thought of America as exceptional. Then I happened to grow up, we moved to Colorado. And so for me, the whole concept of manifest destiny made a lot of sense. And in Colorado, you learn history from the perspective of the cowboys. So that was okay. And I did think of America as exceptional. I know now what's happened is that exceptionalism is viewed as something that makes us feel superior to everybody. But I do think we're a special country. And whether one reads it in the New Testament or Spider-Man, I believe to whom much is given, much is expected. And so from that sense, I see American exceptionalism. Now, the thing that I write is that I think we are exceptional, but we can't ask that exceptions be made for us. And therefore, when we don't want to be part of any international norms or are treaty allergic or think that the rules don't apply to us, then that's where I think exceptionalism then becomes a very negative thing for America.
That's wonderful. I want to press you a little bit on it because to me, it's, no pun intended, fundamental to what we're talking about. Great story during the Civil War. A minister comes to the White House, says to Lincoln, "I'm so glad that God is on our side." And he says, No, I just want to make sure we're on God's side. He's a tricky fella, God, to pin down on whose side he's on. And so many people think that he's registered in their party and he's voting with them. How do you manage and marshal the wonderful spirit and substance of what you're saying about that we are, I love saying shining city on a hill because only Ronald Reagan could improve on John Winthrop and Jesus. Yeah. Is the vision, it's city on a hill. Yeah. But we all say shining because Reagan said it. One of his great contributions. I think that I agree with you personally that we are special. But it's so tricky because if you begin to believe that everything you're doing is divinely ordained and therefore part of a plan or justified, then you can commit horrible sins, horrible injustices, and feel quite good about it.
Well, it's very interesting because I have to admit that my going-in hypothesis on this book was that George Bush was an anomaly in American history in terms of his relationship with God. And then I went back and read a lot of books, including yours, and could really see that he's not. Every American president in some form or another invoked God, and the way that our country started obviously was on a religious basis. And you had a president even like President McKinley who thought it was his duty to Christianize the Philippines, even though they were Catholic, or maybe because they were Catholic. So
You're splitting hairs.
This was really something that was clearly a part of American history. Then the part that I've had the hardest time with, frankly, is Woodrow Wilson. As somebody who was born in Czechoslovakia, Woodrow Wilson is a great hero. In fact, every Czech town has a Woodrow Wilson railroad station. And so I never could see anything wrong with Woodrow Wilson. And the more that I then went back and looked at him, and he thought that he was preordained to be president, I had a quote in the book, and I put that in the afterword, frankly, but I have a quote where George Bush has said, "God wants me to be president." And the way that he runs policy is basically to say that God is on our side, and that is very evident from what happened in 9/11. And that is and if you begin to justify everything you do on the basis of the clarity that God is on your side, you then begin not to take any consideration of other policies. Whereas if you say we have to be on God's side, which is what Abraham Lincoln did say, it does mean that you at least have to think a little bit more about what it is you're doing in order to be on God's side, rather than just deciding that everything you do, God wanted you to do. But it is a tricky thing, and it's very tricky if you believe that you go back to the statement of what Jefferson said about Israel. The Israelis think they're chosen people, that God is on their side, which then, in some ways, gets translated wrong also. So I like Abraham Lincoln's phraseology, which not only puts you on the right track, but means that you have to think through what you're going to do in order to be on God's side.
I also think that Lincoln's acknowledgement of the essential mystery of life is critical. He came to basically say the will of God prevails, but I'm not sure that's exactly how he put it, but damned if I know how. Yeah. That would be the Newsweek rendering of the second inaugural. If we had to put it in Periscope, that would be the quick way of doing it.
John, I think, though, what is so complicated, and I've had a very hard time with this, is that if you are a real believer, then you are certain about certain things. And I got very critical of the certainty that President Bush and some people have. He's not alone in all of this. And that troubles me. So maybe we should ask Father Hare. But I think that there really is a problem in terms of how you are sure of your belief, but not so certain that you don't allow any opinion in. And doubt. I mean, I like President Clinton, when we talked about this, really the reason he quotes the Apostle Paul, I see through a glass darkly, is that there is no way to have complete certainty in this life. Right. So I can deal with that better, but it's that issue of certainty and having a belief versus allowing some doubt in order to question what it is you're doing and whether you're doing the right thing.
Let me press you on that just once more. I completely agree, but as you say, the complexities within the complexities. And in your life experience, this example will resonate deeply. Winston Churchill was no great fan of nuance. He did not get lost in the details in the 1930s and through 41 and 42. He was fascinated by the post-war world, but in terms of defining the struggle against Germany as good versus evil, saying on June 4th, 1940, that in God's good time, the new world would step forth with all its power and might to the rescue and liberation of the old, in God's good time. He was speaking in theological terms about political matters, and the implication was that he was fighting a divine mission. He was leading a divine mission against evil. President Roosevelt, though slower to the party, also did that. As you know, the only thing he said on D-Day in public was to read a prayer of his own composition, that he used the 1928 Book of Common Prayer to write. 6 minutes, long prayer, very un-Episcopalian, the length of that prayer. So is it okay when it's Churchill and Roosevelt fighting the Nazis, but it's not okay when it's Bush and Blair fighting Islamic terrorists? Does it matter? Is it the mystery of history? It depends on the circumstances of a given era?
Well, I think a lot does. First of all, I think it's very interesting to go back and read how leaders summon their people to a great struggle. And I'm not a speechwriter, but it's very interesting to see how words evolve, and as certainly having been involved in the creation of a State of the Union message where the whole government sends in things, it's just interesting to see how hortatory language evolves. And I think it is important for leaders to speak in terms that arouse people's sense of patriotism or need to do the right thing. I think that what is interesting is that, I happen to think that there is such a difference, that there is evil in the world, and that we know what it is. It is murdering innocent people, and so rousing people to fight evil, I think, is an accurate and important thing to do. It's different, though, than a divine mission to be good, because I think it's much harder to figure out what good is. And so, even what Jesus Christ said, am I good? Only God is good. So, it is, and so I've said about the U.S., when you ask about exceptionalism, is I think we're pretty good enough, doing the best we can, but it's very hard to be totally sure that you are fighting the divine mission. So that's the good-evil thing. I do also think that we did not have the same problem in World War II of dealing with a religiously based enemy. And one of the real problems that we're having now is generally, and I had problems in writing the book, is finding, the right words or the right terms. And so even though Eisenhower could talk about the Great Crusade, it's somewhat different when you're fighting the Muslims to go talk about the crusade. And so when George Bush chose those words, that was a big mistake. And I think that you have to look at the context of what you're dealing with. And I don't happen to believe in a clash of civilizations, but I do think that there is an issue about when you are dealing with Islam or Christians and Jews in terms of trying to find the right terminology. So you do need to be hortatory and evocative, but you have to be really careful about the circumstance in which you're doing it.
Let me ask you about Islam, just as a theoretical statement, true or false. Assess the validity of the statement. Islam is roughly where Christianity was in 1400.
Well, you and I talked about this a little bit, and I've thought about it, and the answer is yes and no.
I love academics and diplomats.
Yeah. I think one could make that argument in terms of the evolution and enlightenment, etc. On the other hand, if you think about it, it's pretty insulting to think that they have to go through the same evolutionary process, and that maybe there's something different that is going on in terms of the history of the evolution of Islam, and to think that they have to go through a certain kind of enlightenment process. I do think that the issues, and one of the hard parts that I had is we say Islam. There is no such thing as just one, and most Americans actually, who are victims of the media, believe that most Muslims live in the Middle East. And so they have mixed up a lot of things which are Arab, cultural, with Islam, or various parts of Islam, and most of the Muslims live in Indonesia and India. And so I think that, having now said I shouldn't use the word, I use it, Islam does have to go through some kind of a new iterative process, and they have a term for this, ishtihar, which is a way that they had in fact evolved a lot of the Quran. And I think that a lot of that tradition was really set aside for a long time, and that they need to go back to some kind of a way where, and again the terminology is difficult here, moderate Muslims would in fact go to this process of evolving what's written in the Quran to suit modern times. I mean, there's always this example is that because falafel was not mentioned in the Quran, they shouldn't have those kinds of people selling that food at this time, or because customs were so different when the word was received. And so some of it needs to be updated, but I'm not sure that one could state it the way you have, that it needs to go through 6 centuries.
John?
Yes.
Do you want to do one more question? I want to open it up for
Oh, absolutely.
We're having such a nice time.
Let me ask. Let me just ask.
I hate to break this.
Yeah.
One thing, then I'm going to read my favorite paragraph.
Okay. Or you can do it.
I hate to make you a victim of the author, but what can Americans do to encourage that iterative process without appearing condescending?
Well, that's the hard part. I think that we have to be very careful not to be the instigators of it, because it automatically then becomes not valid in terms of what they need to do. What I find very interesting are American Muslims who I would wish that they would take a much larger role in this. I've developed some fascinating friendships in the course of this, and Imam Faisal, whom I think you know, who's a Kuwaiti-born but an American, is somebody who is very thoughtful on this process. I don't know how many people know this, but the largest Arab American communities around Detroit, and I've gone up and met with a lot of the imams up there, and that in some ways American imams could be more helpful in the process, but I think we have to be very careful. And part of what's happening is when anybody is suppressed, in many ways the extremist elements come out. But we have to be careful not to be the kiss of death to anybody who wants to have change. If the American administrations pat somebody on the head, then they're automatically kind of black sheep within whatever process they're involved in.
Let me read this quickly. Is that right, Mr. Dean?
Please. Absolutely.
And then we'll just adore you because we love this paragraph. You don't have to respond. We care so deeply about religion that our feelings sometimes manifest themselves in odd ways. As I have visited with people in the years since this book was published, I have often been warned that the end times are nearly upon us. I have been given pamphlets that promise, with illustrations, to show me the path to heaven. I have been invited to forsake the major religions in order to commune with butterflies and seek truth in the woods. I have even been asked by a writer in California to co-produce a musical on the futility of genocide with dance numbers featuring Eva Braun. I just think that's a great paragraph, Madam Secretary. I have no larger point. I just love it. Thank you.
All of it true.
Thanks,
I'm happy to say we're not quite done, because now I'm going to open it up for questions from the audience. We should have 3 microphones, I think, around, and there's one here, and where's our microphone over here, if anyone wants to? I'm sorry. Okay, in the back. And fourth, the other is all the way at the other side. So if you would go to one of these ladies, if you have a question, I'll try to recognize you. Yes.
Yes. I wonder whether you could comment, please, on Jimmy Carter's book, Peace, Not Apartheid, and especially on whether you think that it and the ensuing discussion, both in Israel and in this country, has brought things forward, has opened things up, or has closed doors.
I was laughing with John because, and I have to tell this story, we were together in January at the University of Georgia, where those of us that have been part of the Carter administration were celebrating the 30 years. John was the moderator of a panel. And
what second prize?
Right. So President Carter was sitting in the front row, and I had previously been asked, before I ever got there, by somebody whether I had read Jimmy Carter's book, and I hadn't. And the first question from those people before was, did I think that Jimmy Carter was anti-Semitic? And I was able to say, he's not, but I haven't read the book. So before I went down to this thing in Georgia, I deliberately decided not to read the book so that I didn't have to go through this. So John was the moderator. Jimmy Carter's sitting in the front row, and his first question was, so what do you think of Jimmy Carter's book? And then he says, well, before you answer that question, how many of you on this panel have read the book? So Zbig was the only one. The panel was Stan Turner, Howard Baker, Brzezinski, and me. So then, because we weren't answering that right, John says, so how many of you think President Carter is a bigot? And he's sitting right there. So
Why America loves the press.
Right. So I said that, no, I didn't think he was a bigot. And part of the problem with his book, which I have now read, is that I think he really slights what President Clinton did, which is part of a longer psychodrama. So I said something like, President Carter did an incredible amount at his Camp David, and he and President Clinton understand the Middle East better than anybody else. Later in that panel, President Carter was not happy with any of this, stormed up to the stage and said, I really am disappointed in this panel. And I'm amazed that people haven't read my book, especially since I read theirs and since I was the only one. So all in all, your question. And when John and I were talking about doing this together, I said, John, you're not going to ask me if I've read President Carter's book. Right.
Every word the Secretary of State just said is true.
So, I have read his book, and in fact, I went down and had a one-on-one discussion with him at the Carter Center. I think that, frankly, it's not a very good book, that it has taken some facts and written them accurately and some not. It is a book that I think is slanted in a way, and I find very interesting that what one can do with writing, because he takes the facts, but it just depends on where you put the adjective or what tense the verb is. And so, and I think the title is very unfortunate. What was interesting, though, in our discussion, and I can appreciate this, President Carter said that he wrote the book out of frustration because he worked so hard on the Middle East and because I think he thought that a great deal of time has been wasted, and it has. I think to some extent it has done what he wanted, which is to create a lot of discussion, and I think that is good. But I also think that it has created additional resentment against those who have not been active enough in this. So I think it's a mixed bag. It certainly has made it a bestseller. I think it's a very bad title. And he knows that, and he has begun, I think, to explain it in a different way in terms of apartheid being more a question of who owns the land rather than a way of separating different kinds of peoples. He has, in fact, also said that a sentence that I think was most unfortunate, in which he basically kind of made it seem as if it was okay for the Palestinians to use violence until they have a state, which I think of Brandeis he ultimately said he didn't agree with. There's been a lot of discussion about who has what power in the Middle East. I think another set of discussion has been created by academics here. I don't know, what's the name of the dean in Mearsheimer? And I think many questions. I think I'm never afraid of discussion, but given the mood in the country, I think there's some issue about stating it, making it seem as if everything is Israel's fault in this, which is the way, unfortunately, I think this book is presented. And that is now clear that I'm not a diplomat, nor that I'm ever going to see Jimmy Carter again.
Another question here. Let me just see, go to the side. I have one I'm missing here. Yes, sir.
Hi.
Can I go back on something? But he had every right to write the book. And that's where I differ with people who are angry at him for writing the book. He did have every right to write the book and write it the way he wanted to write it. So, sorry.
Hi, my name is Lou Calhoun. I'm a student at the Divinity School. And even though I'm asking a hard question, I still want your autograph back to the John F. Kennedy discussion. My question is, I was watching an interview with you, I think at the Exonian Society of some sort, and you said that Clinton and Carter were different in Bush in that Bush allows faith to drive policy or to influence policy. And so my question was a broader one on what role do you think religious arguments have in forming policy, if any role, and whether or not they are legitimate arguments.
Well, I think that what I was saying about what I had argued on earlier was that I had worked for two very religious presidents, and you can't divorce people from their faith. And I think that it is important to know what people's faiths are and why they believe what they believe. But the difference between President Clinton and Carter and President Bush is, and it goes back to the question that John was talking about, we were talking about the certainty of President Bush's religious faith and the kind of sense that it's okay to interpret exactly the way he thinks, the clarity, the certainty of his faith. But what I'm basically arguing in this book is that it is, and again, to go back to something I said, and I always have to repeat, I'm not a theologian, and I haven't turned into a religious mystic. I am a problem solver. And so I think that to that extent, that because we can't separate people from their faith, and we have to know what the basis of various issues are that we're dealing with in foreign policy, it is essential to know what the religious basis of a particular argument is, or what the context is of a particular fight. So I am advocating in this book something that I think is quite surprising for a practicing diplomat, is that our diplomats need to know what people's faiths are, what the history of the religious history of a particular issue is, that it is also very important to have religious advisors. Now, when I went to negotiate the anti-ballistic missile treaty, I knew a lot about arms control, but I didn't know everything about every trajectory and targeting, and so I had arms control experts who went with me. When we were talking about, airline patterns and open skies or whatever, I understood the economic value of having American airplanes be able to fly into Heathrow, but I didn't know all the details, so we had advisors on that. So I'm saying that the Secretary of State needs to have religious advisors. And then I also think that we need to use religious leaders in helping to resolve conflicts. First, in some conflict resolution. Because I believe in separation of church and state, I would not have religious leaders be at the negotiating table, but I would certainly have them around as resources. And then most important, I would have them as validators of decisions. So I think it's important to understand the religious context of decisions, but I don't think it's right for the President of the United States to make his religious beliefs the policy of the United States, whether it has to do with stem cell or whether it has to do with the war or any different aspect. I mean, these are elected leaders and are supposed to reflect the views of the country.
I'm even here. Bruce, is that you? I must apologize. I can't really see very well with these lights in my face, so I think it's Bruce McEver now, and I apologize, Bernadette, for not being able to see you in the back or Luke, you, but I'm blinded here, so right. Please go ahead.
I'm fascinated by this discussion. Thank you very much. I'm Bruce McEver. I'm on the Dean's Council here. I have two questions. One is the importance of coming from, as a problem solver, and coming from Jimmy Carter's book, the importance of a solution between Israel and the Palestinians as a key to sort of solving the problem in the Middle East. And then, two, the hopeful, is there any chance of a comprehensive settlement in that part of the world, or is it something that's going to take us years, that's going to be over a series of time?
Well, first of all, there have been very interesting discussions recently as to whether the Israeli-Palestinian issue is the central problem in the Middle East, and is everything, are all the problems due to that? I don't buy that. I think that there are plenty of other problems. And I must say, you know, President Clinton did a lot of reading, and he made all of us read, and he would assign books to us. And one that he assigned to me was a book about the creation of the modern Middle East, The Peace to End All Peace, that I think many of you probably know, by an American historian, David Fromkin. And it really is fascinating to see how the Middle East was put together after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, all artificial countries, and Iraq is the perfect example of it. And the short version is that the modern Middle East was created as a result of the British and French bureaucracies lying to each other. But the bottom line is there are enough problems there that it is not the Israeli-Palestinian issue. But the Israeli-Palestinian issue is important to be solved for its own right, and also because it is a key and important aspect, but not the only one. What is interesting when you are dealing in any particular negotiation is you either decide that you're going to do it small step at small step and build up to a large picture, or if that isn't working, then you put everything on the table and you do a lot of trade-offs. The history of this was very interesting to me because we came into office and there was Prime Minister Rabin and the Oslo process. And the Oslo process was based on the fact that there would be the beginning of a developing relationship of trust between Prime Minister Rabin and Chairman Arafat. And one of the all-time incredible scenes was the one in September 1993 on the White House lawn where President Clinton is trying to bring the two of them together and they shake hands. And the basis of that was that there would be small steps taken and trust would be developed, then they could move to the final status issues. Any assassination is terrible, but Prime Minister Rabin's, I think, was one of the crucial disasters in terms of this. And Prime Minister Netanyahu, whereas Rabin had been kind of the lubricant of the process, Netanyahu was sand in the works, and the whole thing slowed down. And so then there was the sense that there needed to be a comprehensive approach to it, which was what was happening at Camp David. And so I think that was an essential part. Now, the religious part of this comes in the following way. And I apologize to some of you that heard me earlier. What happened was that President Clinton knew a great deal about the religious background. We all had finally really studied it. And a lot of people think we went to Camp David because President Clinton wanted a legacy. That is not why we were there. It was because Prime Minister Barack had a lot of very interesting ideas and wanted to use President Clinton's last months in order to see whether we could have a comprehensive settlement. And Barack was a very bold thinker and a very bad politician. And he did not want to tell us what his bottom lines were, which was not helpful because Arafat did not want to go there at all. And we get him there, and it's a long, I'm sure that if I were to ask any of you whether you'd like to spend a couple of weeks at Camp David, you might say yes. I can tell you after 2 weeks in the rain with the Israelis and Palestinians, I don't care if I ever go back. But basically what happened was that Barack puts these ideas on the table, and the bottom line is that Arafat had every right to make decisions about the size of a Palestinian state. He was the Palestinian leader. But he did not have the capability of making decisions about the disposition of the holy places because he was not the sole keeper of them. The keepers were the Saudis and various others, and we were asking him to make that decision. And we began something else then because the question was the sovereignty over the holy places. And so we began to talk about a new concept called divine sovereignty, that it would belong to God. And I think it's still an interesting concept. Arafat was, I think, incapable of making that kind of decision, both intellectually and also politically. But I do think that one has to consider some things like that make you realize that there are other aspects to this than just a normal negotiation. And I do think that we are now at a stage where you can do neither comprehensive nor small steps because the trust is gone and because you have leaders that are very weak. Prime Minister Olmert is jealous of President Bush's popularity ratings. His popularity rating is within within statistical error. Sir, no.
Thank you. I'm going to take one last question. I think someone's standing over here, but I really... or on this side. I'm sorry. Okay, right here. If you can get the microphone. I'm sorry to have only one left, but we are at the witching hour. In fact, I'm probably 5 minutes late, but let's do have one.
I'm the witch? Yeah. Well.
No.
Madam Secretary, thank you for being with us tonight. My name is Melinda Weeks. I'm an alumnus of the Divinity School. As a problem solver, could you speak to the best case scenario for ending the Darfur crisis?
That is one of the great tragedies, because one of the things that was so interesting to me at the UN, as a student of international affairs, and I had spent my entire life kind of studying international system, and it was all based on the nation state and sovereignty. And when the UN began to work properly after the end of the Cold War, it was so fascinating to sit in Security Council meetings and think that we were actually talking about things that were going on inside people's countries. It's quite an amazing aspect, and something that came from the Second World War, where people did not know what, or said they didn't know what was happening with the Jews, and yet all of a sudden we had all this information and we really knew what was going on. Once you know, you have a responsibility to do something about it. And so the question is, what is the mechanism that allows you to do it? And I think all of us bear a lot of guilt for what did not happen in Rwanda. And the truly ironic part was, as people were commemorating the 10th anniversary of Rwanda, which I called volcanic genocide that happened after the president's plane was shot down, and we're watching rolling genocide in Darfur. But the problem is that the concept of sovereignty still exists, and President Bashir is not letting any UN peacekeeping force in there. I think that in the best case scenario, and this is really best case, is that the Chinese, who are the ones that have the most influence over Bashir, instead of having Hu Jintao go there and give him money for palaces, would in fact put pressure on them, because they are important to them because of the oil revenue, and that Bashir would in fact allow a peacekeeping force to go in there, which would be a primarily African force. One of the problems has been and suggestions are made that NATO should go in there, but the idea of a force that is composed of some former colonial powers is not a good idea. And so the best case is that Bashir would let them in. If he does not, I think there are other options. One is to create a no-fly zone, and the other, I think is a possibility. Every day we're now reading about problems between Sudan and Chad, and the allegation is that some of the Sudanese are trying to overthrow the government in Chad. And if Chad were to ask for a peacekeeping force that could be on the border, that would be one kind of a mandate that would allow a UN force closer in. And the U.S., I think, we are so overstretched, we don't have troops to be sending anywhere. But the U.S. should be able to help an augmented AU/UN peacekeeping force in order to move the process forward. I think the UN can play a very important role here. I'm not particularly impressed with the fact that the Secretary General, the new one, is kind of delaying process here instead of putting more pressure on Bashir and getting the Chinese to be more helpful. So it's a very difficult issue in that regard, but could prove a very useful thing to put the UN back into action. So,
thank you, Madam.
Could I do
yes,
this,
please.
because and again I apologize to some who heard me earlier, but it goes to the question that John asked about what I see as America's role, and if I could, do you mind if I read that
Absolutely.
again? Okay. And because it goes to the exceptionalism question. Hold on one second. And I have, in my role, both as an academic and as representative of the United States, thought a lot about what I think the U.S. role should be. And I have talked a lot about the fact that I think we're an indispensable nation, that we have to be a part of things. So this is my best shot at how to describe this. Ours is a country of abundant resources, momentous accomplishments, and unique capabilities. We have a responsibility to lead, but as we fulfill that obligation, we should bear in mind the distinction pointed out by John Adams. Liberty, at least in the sense of free will, is God's gift, not ours. It is also morally neutral. It may be used for any purpose, whether good or ill. Democracy, by contrast, is a human creation. Its purpose is to see that liberty is directed into channels that respect the rights of all. As the world's most powerful democracy, America should help others who desire help to establish and strengthen free institutions. But in so doing, we should remember that promoting democracy is a policy, not a mission, and policies must be tested on the hard ground of diplomacy, practical politics, and respect for international norms. Our cause will not be helped if we're so sure of our rightness that we forget our propensity as humans that we make mistakes. Though America may be exceptional, we cannot demand that exceptions be made for us. We're not above the law, nor do we have a divine calling to spread democracy any more than we have a national mission to spread Christianity. We have, in short, the right to ask, but never to insist or blithely assume that God bless America.